Norma Schifano will be presenting on Crossing Borders, What Happens When Languages Meet. Norma is an Associate Professor in Modern Languages at the University of Birmingham. She specialises in Romance comparative linguistics, with specific attention paid to linguistic minorities, in particular the Italo-Greek speakers of southern Italy and migrant communities, specifically the Latinx population of the UK. Her research encompasses a variety of topics in formal morphosyntax, including verb movement, with a particular focus placed upon the investigation of internal versus contact-induced linguistic change. Norma is also interested in ethical challenges and opportunities raised by collaborations between academics and third sector organisations representing linguistic minorities. So in this presentation, Norma is going to explore the possible effects of language contact on the deep architecture of language, with case studies of contact between unrelated varieties such as Spanish with English and Italo-Romance with Greek. We'll examine how contact can accelerate linguistic change and act as a catalyst for further development, while exploring instances where languages remain resistant to external influence in surprising ways. Norma, it's lovely to have you with us. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Dom. How are you?
I'm fantastic, thank you. So we're delighted to pass controls over to you now for the final presentation of the day.
Okay. There we are. Right. Can you all see my screen now?
It's just appearing. Yes, we can see it. Perfect.
Fantastic. Okay. Right. So thank you so much, everybody, for being here today, and special thanks to the organizers for having me and for putting together such an exciting program for today. I'm very excited to be here today to discuss a topic I'm deeply passionate about, and that is contact between languages and how this can impact many of the linguistic communities we work with and we collaborate with. Before we dive in, I would like to start by giving you a brief roadmap of my presentation today. So I will start with a very short introduction to language contact. So what do I mean by language contact? What is it? Where does it take place? And then we'll see a few examples. I will then talk a little bit about some of the possible effects of language contact, first of all from a purely linguistic point of view, but then I would also like to say a few things about its possible effects more from a sociological perspective or from the community's perspective, if you like. And then I will wrap up by talking about its significance. So the aim of my presentation today, what I'm hoping to achieve, is promoting a reflection among language professionals and everybody with an interest in languages about the challenges and the opportunities raised by working and collaborating with migrant communities and linguistic minorities, because these are the communities where we often see the effects of language contact in the light of their specific linguistic profiles and the linguistic needs that I will discuss briefly today. Why do I think that this is particularly relevant? Why should we care? Well, as you surely know, global migration is increasing, and we know that this trend is expected to continue. So realistically, we can expect more and more language professionals and people working with languages to work and collaborate with this kind of communities in the future. And this is why I think it's important that we reflect on their linguistic profile and their linguistic needs, specifically in relation to language contact. Right, so what do I mean by language contact? What is language contact? Well, in very simple terms, and I'm going to use some quotes here, language contact is about the way in which linguistic systems influence one another. So why do linguistic systems influence one another? Well, because, I'm using another quote here, languages do not exist in an ecological vacuum. So the lives of the people who speak a language influence its very nature and properties in many ways, and often these people also speak other languages, and these languages may exert an influence on it as well. And this is what we call language contact. Now, is language content a common phenomenon? Absolutely, yes. I've got another quote here from Grant, who observes that there has probably never been, nor is, nor ever will be, a linguistic system that has not been modified in some way by the incorporation of elements from at least one other linguistic system. That's why this conversation is really important. Now, where do we see language contact happening? Well, on the one hand, contact may happen obviously within territories. So these are instances of historical language contact, which spans across many generations. It can happen within the same territories. These are instances of direct contact when you have mixtures of populations and cohabitations of different length. But it can also happen across different territories. So these are instances of what we call indirect contact, which is very common and can happen for a variety of cultural, economic, and political reasons as well. So one example of contact happening within a specific territory comes from the extreme south of Italy, and I'm referring here to a very well-known instance of historical contact between Greek and Italo-Romance. So as some of you might know, Greek colonies were established in most of the coastal area of southern Italy, beginning in 1800 BCE, as you can see in the map on this slide, and that was followed by later Byzantine domination. And a consequence of this cultural situation is that Greek and Latin first, and then Greek and Italo-Romance were spoken alongside each other for nearly 3 millennia. And we still have some pockets of Italo-Greek being spoken in some villages in southern Italy. And contact in these areas has radically shaped the local languages, to the point that Rolfs was a German linguist who worked extensively on Italo-Greek. When talking about the local varieties of these areas, he coined a famous slogan it's called Spirito Greco Materia Romanza, so Greek soul and Romance material, when talking about these languages of these areas, which have, as he says, a Greek soul and just Romance bricks. So we said contact can be within a territory. We've just seen an example, but contact can also happen inside a speaker's mind. Okay, and so this is contact happening within one mind, within one or just a few generations. A very well-known example of this is regards Latin American communities in the US. So that's an instance of an ongoing linguistic contact between Spanish on the one hand and American English. Not as well known as the American communities, but there are also growing Latin American communities in the UK that are gradually receiving increasing attention finally by the academic community. And that's another instance of ongoing contact between varieties of Spanish and a different variety of English, so British English in this case. Obviously, the list of contact scenarios is almost infinite. Okay, I've just given you some examples today. If we think of Spanish, for example, and if we try to come up with a list of contact zones, that becomes really, really extensive. Lipsky, for example, more than 10 years ago now, came up with the list that you see in this slide, and which continues on in the next one, where he tried to map and identify all the areas where Spanish is in contact with other local languages. As you can see, it's a very extended list, so it's not possible to be exhaustive, but just to give you a sense of how content really is pervasive. Right, so we've said a few things about language and content in general. What I would like to do now is discuss some of its possible effects in more detail. So when it comes to language content effects, we can distinguish, as I've mentioned earlier, a linguistic level and a sort of more sociological perspective. So I'd like to start from linguistic effects. Now, One of the most well-known effects of language content obviously regards lexis. Okay, I've put here a word cloud on the right of this slide, which shows some very common examples of vocabulary that Spanish has borrowed from English, but also cases of mixture between the two languages. This is one of the most easy identifiable instances of language content, when languages borrow words from each other and they combine them as well. But what about what I'm calling here the core architecture of language, or more technically, morphosyntax? So can grammar also be radically affected when languages get in contact with each other? Now, this is a very fascinating question, because the traditional view for a very long time has been that morphosyntax is very resistant to contact-induced change. So the idea for a very long time has been that when languages get in contact with each other, the vocabulary changes very rapidly, but not much happens to the DNA of languages. However, more recent research has shown that given sufficient time, given sufficient intensity of bilingualism, the core architecture of language as well can be radically shaped by contact. So grammar as well can be borrowed. So morphosyntactic contact-induced change obviously is more difficult to identify, because when languages borrow grammatical structures, copies are never perfect, because there's always a possibility that the phenomenon you're looking at is an internal development and not the output of language content. And it's also very difficult to identify, because it is often the case that there are multiple sources. So there's a possibility that the structure you're looking at is coming from different languages. But it is very fascinating, because ultimately it really helps us understanding the more general mechanism of language change, and ultimately how the language faculty works. And that's where my research is focusing, and that's where I'm going to focus a bit today as well. And in particular, I'm going to concentrate on the effects of morphosyntactic content, grammatical content in the speaker's mind. Now, these effects vary depending on the type of multilingual speaker we're looking at. And today I'm going to discuss briefly possible effects on 3 different types of speakers. So first of all, I will talk about so-called attrited speakers. So we're looking at people who belong to the first generation of a population who has moved abroad, so people who have learned another language and have become bilingual later in life. I will say a few things also about so-called heritage speakers, so the children of people who have moved abroad and had to learn a new language. And I will also say a few things about so-called semi-speakers. So these are the speakers that we find in context of language shift or language death. So let's start with the attrited speakers. What is attrition? But what do I mean by grammatical attrition? Well, there are in the literature several definitions of this phenomenon, which really depends on the focus that you take. So you can take a linguistic perspective, you can take a sociological perspective, or a psycholinguistic perspective. From a linguistic point of view, kind of technical definition I'm using here of attrition comes from Hicks and colleagues' recent work on that, where they define attrition as a potentially enduring modification to the native language grammar of an individual under pressure from extensive exposure to a second language. In more simple terms, attrition is any changes in a speaker's native grammar because of declining use of this native grammar in favor of a second language. So fundamentally, attrition is language content in one person's mind. Just to give you a practical example, think of a Latin American person who moves to the UK and they start to use English much more than their Spanish. What happens to their Spanish? So there's lots of interest, obviously, in the ways in which Spanish will affect their English as they learn this new language. But there's also a branch of studies which is interested in the opposite direction, so what English eventually is doing to their Spanish. Now, why is attrition interesting? Why should we care? Well, there are many reasons. I'm just listing a couple of them here. First of all, attrition is very interesting and very fascinating because there is abundant evidence from experimental psychology that shows that unused memory traces fade over time. However, there's also plenty of evidence which is showing that speakers who ceased to use actively their native languages because, for example, they moved abroad, they can maintain their languages for decades. And so from a psychological point of view, this really poses a great challenge for our understanding of how forgetting and memory work. From a more technical point of view, attrition is also very fascinating because it is not the case that anything goes. So it's not the case that anything can happen to your native language if you cease to use it in favor of a second language. In other words, we know from research that attrition is a heavily restricted phenomenon. And that poses, again, a number of challenges for our understanding of language faculty. So if the language faculty includes mechanisms which can affect a mature L1 grammar, why is it the case that this phenomenon is very restricted and very rarely attested? Now, let me give you a practical example. So we're talking about attrition in very abstract terms, but I also wanted to give you an example of what I mean by that. And here I'm reporting an example from a study which was conducted more than 20 years ago now by Simply and colleagues. They were working with Italian and Greek speakers who were almost native in English because they had been living in the UK for an extended period of time. And what they were interested in analyzing was speakers' use and interpretation of null and overt pronouns, as well as preverbal versus postverbal subjects, because these are areas where Italian and Greek on the one hand and English on the other hand behave differently. So the idea was testing whether English was having any effects on these speakers, Italian and Greek. Now, focusing just on the Italian group and just on null versus overt subjects, the main result that Simply and colleagues got from this study, which is very fascinating, is that in this group of Italian speakers, the interpretation of null pronouns remain absolutely unchanged. And where the only area where they saw some differences was in the interpretation of overt pronouns. So the conclusion that they reached from this study, which was then confirmed by many later investigations, is that syntactic attrition is a highly selective phenomenon. So the core grammatical structures, in this case, the use of null pronouns, remain absolutely stable. But what was changing was the semantic and pragmatic features of the language. So it was more on the discourse level that attrition was working. Right, so let's move on now so we've seen the first generation, so language contact happening in the first generation. How about the second and the third generation? So how about so-called heritage speakers? Now, again, there are in the literature several definitions for heritage speakers depending on the perspective that one takes. I've got here a fairly technical definition which says that heritage speakers are bilingual speakers who acquire their native heritage language in a minority setting under reduced input conditions and under influence of a dominant majority language. In more simple terms, we can define heritage speakers using a title from a recent publication by one of the leading experts on heritage linguistics, Montreal, and the title is Native Speakers Interrupted. Okay, so imagine the children, for example, of a Latin American person who moved to the UK. What does their Spanish look like compared to the Spanish of a monolingual person who has not experienced any attrition? So the children of the first generation are what we called heritage speakers. Now, why are heritage speakers interesting? Why should we care about this type of language content? Again, there are many reasons. I'm just picking one here, and I'm quoting here an article by Bayram and colleague, and they observe how is it possible that native child naturalistic acquisition, albeit in heritage language context, can result in large disparities in grammatical competence between heritage speaker and monolinguals, as well as across subsets of heritage speakers. So, in summary, the question is, if we all share the same language faculty, how is it possible that speakers, heritage speakers who acquire languages in these different contexts exhibit such remarkable differences? So let me give an example of these differences that have been observed among heritage speakers. So here I'm citing a study by Montreal and colleagues from about 10 years ago on the erosion of a syntactic phenomenon known as differential object marking. So this is a type of a marker that some languages use in front of a subset of direct objects. And in particular, they were interested in speakers of Spanish, Hindi, and Romanian in the US. And what they wanted to see was whether differential object marking among these heritage speakers is vulnerable to attrition, because this is a phenomenon which is not attested in English. So the idea was checking whether these speakers' Spanish, for example, was changing because the speakers are more exposed to English than to Spanish. And they also wanted to see if there were any differences among these different languages they were looking at. And one of the key findings of the study is that DOM is vulnerable to attrition. So these speakers exhibited a different use of this strategy compared to monolingual. And interesting, they found also some differences between languages. So they found that attrition is more evident in Spanish heritage speakers, and then they suggested that this is the case possibly because this marker in Spanish is less acoustically salient. Right, moving on to the last generation. So we're looking at so-called semi-speakers. So these are speakers that we find in context of language death or loss or shift. This is also a very complex phenomenon. There are many definitions available in the literature, but fundamentally we're looking at cases where contact is so extreme that it leads to the disappearance of one of the languages. And this is where you find this kind of speakers. So individuals who have a partial competence in the language, either because they had a limited exposure to that, or because they no longer have the possibility to use it because the community is shrinking. Now, why are semi-speakers interesting? Again, several reasons. I'm picking one here from my own research. Semi-speakers are very interesting because from an intuitive point of view, what you would expect from this type of speaker is that they are going to make a lot of mistakes because they only have a partial competence in the language, because they don't have many opportunities to use it. And this has been suggested in the literature. I've reported here a quote from Poplak and Levy, who observed that semi-speakers can be expected to make all manner of acquisition errors depending on their level of proficiency at the time of data collection. However, what we found in our research on Italo-Greek is that semi-speakers do not simply make mistakes. So a very fascinating phenomenon we looked at has to do with the expression of progressive aspect in Italo-Greek. Things like how do you say I'm eating, I'm walking, I'm sleeping. And what we found is that on the one hand, there is a sort of standard strategy in Italo-Greek, which is what most proficient speakers will use, whereby progressive aspect is expressed by using the verb to stand and a non-finite form of your verb, pretty much like you do in most Romance languages. What we found, however, as well, is that semi-speakers of Italo-Greek consistently produce an alternative structure in which they combine the verb to stand, not with a non-finite verb form, but with a subjunctive. And what is very interesting about this structure is that all the semi-speakers of Greco that we were able to interview systematically produced this kind of structure. And these were speakers who were not contacted with each other, so they could not have influenced each other. And we also found this among speakers of another variety of Italo-Greek, which is spoken in another region. So on the one hand, there's this great consistency in the use of this strategy, and also if you do an analysis, syntactic analysis of this strategy, as we did, what you observe is that this is not a random combination of elements, but this is a structure which is clearly replicating underlying grammatical patterns which are available to these speakers. So this structure is not a mistake. This structure is an innovation, an innovative structure among Semite speakers, which could become potentially new rule of the language if this variety survived. Right. So when talking about contacts, the effects of language contact from a linguistic point of view, I also wanted to say a few things from a more sociological perspective, and I'm going to concentrate here on attrited speakers and on heritage speakers. Now, when it comes to attrited speakers, so again, we're looking at bilinguals who experience some loss or change of their native language. The literature has observed that these speakers can experience varying degrees of psychological distress. This is very easy to understand. Imagine someone who has to leave their country, they move abroad, and for a variety of reasons, they are no longer in contact with their family of origin, they don't use their language anymore, and eventually this leads to a strong and marked decrease in the competence, and this can be psychologically very, very distressful. This is something that you find also, this sort of psychological distress is something you find also among speakers who left their country of origin. They're still in touch with their families, they still use their L1, but nevertheless, the changes which are happening to their language and the fact of being a bilingual speaker can also trigger some distress. So recently I conducted a survey among first generation Latin Americans who live in London. They were all long settled bilinguals, and they were talking about their bilingual linguistic experiences in the UK, and the expressions that you see listed in this slide are some of the comments which came out from this survey when these informants were talking about their bilingual experiences. So it's expressions of feelings like inferior, embarrassed, discriminated, undervalued. Now, obviously, many of these comments have to do with interactions with English speakers. But interestingly, my respondents also reported episodes of linguistic discrimination towards their Spanish. So it's not just about not speaking English well, but it's also about the variety of Spanish that you speak and how this has changed with respect to the way in which the language is spoken in the country of origin. And I've also found among some of these speakers some instances of confusion about the very delicate issue of raising bilingual children. So occasionally bilingualism and code switching were described by some of my respondents as a type of confusion which should not be taught to children. How about heritage speakers, so the children of the first generation who has moved abroad? Well, there are among heritage speakers very well-known questions of linguistic identity. This has been discussed extensively, for example, in relation to Spanglish speakers who are often judged as different or even sloppy speakers of Spanish or English, and they are often considered somehow deficient bilinguals because allegedly they don't have the ability to speak either English or Spanish well. And as I said, there's an extensive literature on this topic. But there are also, and obviously this is all linked, many well-known episodes of discrimination towards heritage speakers. Unfortunately, also in the classroom, sometimes because of prescriptive attitudes that you can find among some educators. So here I'm reporting some comments again from the same survey I conducted. And the first one is a heritage speaker of Spanish who was commenting on some discrimination that she experienced from her secondary schoolmates because of a Colombian accent. Right, I'm mindful of time, so what I would like to do now is just wrapping up and say a few words about the significance of language content. Okay, so in the light of what we said about language content and its possible effects for speakers and for different types of speakers, what can we do when we work with these communities? Well, what does it entail working with this kind of communities? Well, first of all, it entails working with bilingual or multilingual speakers who, as I said, are likely to experience some degree of attrition to their native language. And as I said, this is something which can come with a certain amount of psychological distress and also linguistic discrimination. It entails working with bilingual speakers who are raising children who are heritage speakers of their language. They're not monolingual speakers, but they're heritage speakers of, say, Spanish or Italian. And these, as I said, can lead to confusion and sometimes also misunderstandings surrounding bilingualism and its importance. It also entails working with heritage speakers themselves, so people who can experience challenges in their linguistic identity and well-known episodes of linguistic discrimination. And it can also entail working with speakers whose varieties are gradually being abandoned in context of language shift or language death. And I should stress that this is becoming increasingly more common as more and more languages, unfortunately, are dying and disappearing. So what can we do? And when I say we, I mean anyone with an interest in language professionals, and people who work with this kind of communities. What can we do to mitigate at least some of these effects? Well, when it comes to atriters and the kind of psychological distress I've mentioned, there are many things we can do. One suggestion I've put here is the creation of open access resources and participatory workshops open to the community to promote. I'm just giving some suggestions here. First of all, to promote the idea that attrition is not just a loss, but it can also and should also be seen as a creative and additive process. This is something that many scholars have been working on and something they have been emphasizing. Antonella Sorace, for example, has worked extensively and has written extensively on attrition as a creative process. And that's a very positive way of framing this phenomenon that can really help speakers mitigating the distress that one can get when you realize that your language is no longer as it used to be. But it's also very important to create resources and engaging with communities to promote a more nuanced understanding of what being a native speaker entails. So there are many different types of linguistic nativeness. There are many different types of being a native speaker. And this is a concept that we should really promote and spread, because in today's world, it's becoming increasingly more common that you will be a native speaker of your language in a very different way. And I'm flagging here a fantastic project which was done by Laura Dominguez in Southampton called Vulnerable Native Grammars Project. And as part of that, they also worked with this concept of native speakers and a more diverse and inclusive way of looking at that. As far as heritage speakers are concerned, so heritage speakers, but also parents, carers, educators, I believe that academics and all language professions, we have a duty to communicate scientific findings about bilingualism to combat a lot of misinformation which is available out there. Also, if you Google it, if you Google bilingualism and see what's coming up, you will find several confusing and conflicting advice, often coming not from scientific sources. So it's very important that sometimes people who work with languages take it for granted everybody will see the advantages of being bilingual, but this is not always the case. So it's very important that we communicate these findings, and I'm flagging here one of the many projects who have been working on that. It's called Bilingualism Matters. It's based in Edinburgh, and it's got an excellent website that I strongly recommend that you check. They have plenty of open access resources that can be used to explain the benefits of bilingualism in very accessible terms. And it's also very important, I believe, to promote an inclusive approach to linguistic variation in the classroom, especially. For example, via introducing school students to the study of linguistics. So approaching languages not from a prescriptive point of view, but from a descriptive point of view. And here I am flagging a project I am personally involved. It's called the Linguistics in MFL project, and we have developed plenty of open access resources you can find on our website, which are all about introducing linguistics into schools, and as I said, introducing students to a more inclusive way of looking at language variation. I should stress that communities really value and welcome this kind of opportunities and resources. In 2023, I delivered a number of participatory workshops in London. We looked at concepts such as bilingualism, we looked at code switching, we looked at language variation and the notion of mistake. And the feedback I received was extremely positive. People were really happy to have a space where they could freely discuss their experiences and also the challenges of being a bilingual speaker and raising bilingual children. So it's very important to engage with this kind of activities, but it's also very important to make sure that these activities are informed by conversations with the communities themselves and possibly delivered in collaboration with these communities. So here I'm flagging a special issue which has just been published on the journal Linguistics, which is all devoted to the topic of ethics in linguistics, and there are also specific contributions about collaborations between academics and linguistic minorities. So if you're interested, you can take a look. Finally, and I will then stop, I think it's also very important as researchers, as language professionals, to think of your own vulnerability when you're working with these communities. And here I'm flagging an excellent article by a colleague of mine here in Birmingham who has done a very interesting research about the vulnerability of interpreters, specifically when they work with vulnerable populations. So if you are interested, if you want to see their recommendations, I strongly suggest you take a look at their article. Right, that's all I had to say. So thank you so much for your attention. I think we've got some time for questions now, but if I can't answer all of them and if you want to know more, please do get in touch with me. Thank you.
That's fantastic, Norma. We've got time for just a few questions. Thank you so much for that presentation. Got a question here about so you showed how language contact affects linguistic structures and speakers' identities. How do you see these linguistic and sociological effects interacting and influencing each other?
They do extensively, and we should not undervalue speakers' interest in findings from formal studies and how this can help them reframing some negative perceptions that sometimes people can have about this phenomenon. I've mentioned attrition, and I am someone who's been experiencing attrition because I'm a native speaker of Italian. My Italian has been changing radically because I don't use it as much as I used to. I used to find this very quite upsetting, but by reading and working on the topic and seeing how, from a technical point of view, attrition can actually be seen as an addition, this has helped me a lot. So there is a lot of interconnection between the two phenomena. They're often studied independently from each other because people tend to be either theoretical linguists or sociolinguists. But I think it's very important that the two disciplines talk to each other.
Right, very, very good, very interesting. So another question here. Have you come across, read about language deficits or discrimination taking place within Italy's domestic population? For instance, a person from Rome moving to a Greco community in Salento and experiencing language difficulties or discrimination?
I guess this is a question coming from an Italian person in the audience. Yes, of course. The issue of language variation in Italy is a very strong one. People have strong feelings about different varieties. I myself, I'm from the north of Italy, and I did extensive fieldwork in these Greco-speaking areas. And obviously, I reached the community with my strong Milanese accent, so it was very clear to people that I was not coming from those areas. But the community was extremely welcoming. So I guess communities who are historically bilingual tend to be very open to regional differences, precisely because variation is part of their heritage.
Thank you. Okay. How do you explain that a certain language can be more contaminated by the language of an invader more than another language, despite the two languages being the same and the only difference being a slight geographical difference? As an example, the current Berber or Tamazight language in Algeria has remained more true to the original language than the Moroccan Berber after the Arab invasion of North Africa.
Yeah, so this is, I should say, outside my area of expertise,
Sure.
but there's a whole strand of studies who are looking at the interaction between, I'm going to say, language and power. So there are power dynamics and political and cultural dynamics which deeply affect the possible effects of language content. So again, it's a kind of separate strand of study. So I come more from the technical perspective.
Sure.
But whatever happens at the technical level, there's a first layer, which is precisely where this question is coming from, whereby there are political and social and historical reasons why some effects will be more evident in some contexts and not in others.
Fantastic. Okay, and I'm not going to have the chance to read the remaining questions, but just one more before we go. I know you showed a paper at the end. Are there any specific books you can recommend on this subject?
On attrition, there is the Oxford Handbook of Attrition, which has an extensive collection of overviews of the most recent trends in the field. So that's definitely a first starting point. And there are also excellent handbooks on heritage linguistics by Routledge, Oxford University Press, and Cambridge University Press, where again you can find a kind of state of the art in both these disciplines.